Welcome to the Provoke and Inspire podcast. We are very, very excited for you today because we have an incredible guest, someone that I have been very inspired by and who I've been wanting on the show for a long time. We have Tom Holland. He is an award-winning historian, biographer, and broadcaster. He has written many acclaimed books, including In the Shadow of the Sword, Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, and most recently, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, which is going to be dominating our conversation today. So, Tom, thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks very much for having me. Very honored.
Yeah, hey, so I hate to interrupt, but I just got a
as
text.
I knew you would. Yeah.
I got a text from Nigel. He said that he's a big fan of yours, Tom. Do you know who Nigel is?
I like the sound of Nigel.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
He sounds great.
He does sound great.
Bless you, Nigel.
Yeah.
But he wants to know if you really are Spider-Man.
No, I'm not. And actually, Nigel, that's a terrible question. You've really gone down in my information.
Yeah.
And Nigel, I've got to tell you, you're not the first person to have made that joke.
Yeah, I'm afraid that would be the response.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really wrestled with whether I should go there.
No, millions have.
Well, Nigel went there, so it's all good.
Yeah,
look, your star was rising to just unknown heights, and then along came
plummeted.
It just plummeted to the depths. Yeah. I hate to say it, but it's all right. We all have shadows we must live in and behind and under and such. Look, to give you a little context, so we interact a fair bit with Justin Brierley, and he first mentioned a debate you had with A.C. Grayling, which is how I got down the rabbit trail that eventually led to your book. I devoured your book. I thought it was incredibly fascinating. I did history at university, and so already from that academic perspective, and then of course as it how it intersected with my faith, I thought it was just absolutely fascinating. Now, I'd imagine for those that don't know you, and some who do, you're a bit of an interesting, maybe even enigmatic person in the sense that, again, I'm gonna let you speak for yourself, but you probably wouldn't identify as a Christian in the way we would. I don't know. We could talk about that, and yet your book passionately defends the impact of Christianity on Western culture at a time when a lot of people kind of go with the opposite message. I mean, including the debate you had with A.C. Grayling. And so I would love, as a starting point, to just get a sense for what inspired you to write this. What was kind of the what led you to have this passion to write about the impact of Christianity on culture?
Well, it's a common take that when people write fiction novels, often they're drawing on their childhood, on things they went through when they were young. And actually, the same can be true for nonfiction. And that's definitely the case with the works of history that I've written. So when I was a child, I was raised in the Church of England. I went to church, sung in the choir, went to Sunday school.
Could we have a little preview of the choir singing?
No, you can't, because you can't, because my singing was terrible even then.
So you have this
the choir was in
it
was kind of on its uppers even then. But and so I kind of believed in a kind of faint kind of way. But the truth was that I was much more interested in the Greek gods. I found them much more kind of charismatic and kind of sexy and dramatic. And I really adored the Romans in the way that previously I'd adored dinosaurs, because they were kind of big and fierce and glamorous and I guess safely extinct. And to be honest, if you'd asked me, Pontius Pilate or Jesus, I had completely gone for Pontius Pilate. He had the soldiers, he had the purple, he had the eagles. Jesus does this kind of scruff. And so, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's
no
fine.
worries.
It's real
Very
life.
sorry.
It's Nigel.
Sorry.
It's Nigel.
No, it's not. It's
Nigel's
my
calling
daughter.
you. He's like,
Listen,
Yeah.
I'm going to have to restart. Sorry.
All good.
I forgot to put it on airplay.
This is just real life. This is.
Hey, it just
I do
reminded me
apologize, guys.
to turn my phone
Okay.
off, so it's all good.
Yeah, really sorry.
yeah.
So I just need to
everybody
restart
turn your phones up.
Just need to. Okay, so that's saved. Okay, so I'm going to restart. Okay, yeah. So basically, I although I kind of vaguely believed, I was just much more interested in Greece and Rome. And when I came to write history, that was what I wanted to start with. And I'd always kind of had the sense that where I came from was from the classical world. I stopped believing in the Christian God. I stopped believing in any God, really. And I kind of bought into the idea that there'd been a time of kind of philosophical greatness that had then been blotted out by Christianity. And I kind of saw the Greek and the Roman world as blue skies, and the coming of Christianity as grey autumn drizzle moving in, and then kind of clears up again with the 18th century and the Enlightenment. And that was kind of the myth that I bought into. But when I began writing very concentrated work, so really trying to get into the heads of the Greeks and the Romans in a way that I hadn't done previously, I just found them more and more alien the more I wrote about them. I found them frightening, I found them unsettling, and I began to realize that they were just incredibly different, and that actually I had almost had very little kind of sense of dissent from them at all. And I began to realize that in almost everything I brought, so not just my morals or my ethics, but my kind of deep-rooted assumptions about the way that society should be organized, basically I was Christian. And that was even on the level of language, because it was trying to write about, say, Athens or Rome and use words like, religion or secular or even democracy, even though it was a Greek word. All of these words were so kind of shadowed by Christian assumptions that it was actually really, really difficult to get back and see the world through Greek or Roman eyes. And so I wanted to write Dominion to test that sense that I had, that actually Christianity had changed everything. And that when we try and look back at the pre-Christian world, it's as though there's a kind of haze of dust, and all those little particles are the particles of Christian influence. So that was really my kind of gut assumption. And a key part of that is that people who think in the modern West that they've emancipated themselves from Christianity, firstly, they tend to have done it for reasons that are themselves Christian. And even if they don't define themselves as Christian, their perspectives, their understandings, their assumptions, the very languages that they use, if they come from, from Western Europe, if they're using kind of West European languages, are so shot through with Christian assumptions that they are, to all intents and purposes, Christian.
It's fascinating, because I think in a way, Tom, I identify with what you've done in a book, because we, like, as a podcast and as an organization that we're part of, and also trying to think about how Christianity is relevant today and communicating the message about Jesus and the Gospels in a way that people might connect with today. And your book does that in a fascinating way. And one of the things that really impacted me was the way you talk about the cross as this as this pivotal moment, but also the power of it and the influence it's had in the culture. Like, and I think you make some links to it with understanding how we couldn't have human rights if it wasn't for the cross, and that's actually encouraged my faith, and it's just been amazing. I've brought it up lots of times. I'd love it if you could explain that to our audience a bit more. Why you think the cross is so key to many aspects of our Western culture today?
Well, I think that one of the measures of Christianity's kind of hold on the West, ironically, is that we've become completely desensitized to it. And things that to people in the early generations of Christianity's spread appeared utterly shocking, outrageous, countercultural, just strange, bizarre. Now we are so desensitized to them that we just take them for granted. And one of the profoundest manifestations of that is the assumption that is, absolutely roiling the Western world at the moment, America perhaps particularly, but everywhere across the West, the assumption that those who are persecuted, those who suffer, those who are at the bottom of the pile, somehow it's not just that they have a right to be kind of raised up, but that their very suffering gives them a quality of dignity that perhaps their persecutors, that the strong, the oppressors, don't possess. And by and large, we in the West seem to take this absolutely for granted, that this is the right, this is the right thing. Where does this idea come from? Well, it's absolutely focused in the central image of Christianity, which of course is a criminal nailed to a torture of an instrument of torture. And the cross in the Roman world did not signify the power of the weak over the strong. It signified the opposite. It was the emblem par excellence of Roman power and of the right of the Romans to put to death those who rebelled against the authority of Rome. Whether that was as an insurrectionary in a Roman province, or more particularly a slave in rebellion against a master. And the reason that crucifixion was seen as the paradigmatic torture for a slave was that it was protracted, it was agonizing, but above all, because it was public. And so if you were nailed to a cross, essentially you served as a kind of billboard for Roman power. I mean, I'm sure lots of people watching this podcast will have seen Spartacus, and you'll remember that Crassus nails slaves up on crosses all along the Appian Way. And these are kind of like billboards saying, look at what we can do. If you dare to rebel against our power, this is going to be your fate. So the idea that someone who had suffered this fate might in some way be a part of the divine is an absolutely lunatic one. It's not, there's nothing odd to the Romans in the idea that a man can become a god, because Julius Caesar becomes a god, Augustus Caesar becomes a god. But these are great conquerors, these are great rulers. The idea that a criminal who suffered the death of a slave might be a god, and not just any god, but the one God who has created the entire cosmos, that's lunacy. And Paul, the first person to write about the cross, says as much. He says it's a stumbling block to the Jews, but to everyone else, in other words, to the Greeks, the Romans, this is madness. And we need to get a sense of just how countercultural Christianity was, and therefore by extension how revolutionary it's been in its impact. We need to get back and see that. We need to reawaken ourselves, to resensitize ourselves to the shock and horror of what crucifixion represented to the Romans, and not just see it as a kind of an emblem that our sense kind of bounces off like a pebble being skimmed across a lake surface. We need to.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's, and I think that for you talked about how you're overtly evangelical about this. I think the problem for practicing Christians in the West isn't, in a sense, that the West is no longer Christian. It's precisely that it does remain Christian, and so many of the aspects of Christianity that were its USPs have kind of gone because everyone shares in them. And so it becomes very difficult for Christians to say that they have a unique message, because actually that unique message is now accepted by everyone, even if they're not Christian.
And yet I've heard you talk about how I listened to another podcast where the question was something like, well, what would you say Christians should be doing in this situation? And you pointed again to the foolishness or craziness of the message of the cross, or the things about Christianity that are unusual, weird today. And it's funny because, again, that's what we so often talk about as a podcast or as an organization. We say we got to talk about the power of God in the cross, and that's what stands out today. It's not just the values, the Christian values that everybody has, but those unique things. And I just a comment on this, like, as I said, it really challenged me to rethink. And for our audience, just to emphasize this again, you're coming at this so much from the perspective of a historian. And that's very powerful, because it's easy for us as followers of Jesus to say, the cross is important, Christianity is important. But for you to have done such an in-depth study from a historical perspective, and to look at and to trace the effects of the cross and of the Christian message was powerful to me. And I've brought it up, I love having conversations with people that think differently, that believe differently to me. And I've brought it up with people who would consider themselves atheists or from different backgrounds. And they would, often the conversation goes to human rights and the importance of this. Our humanism, our philosophy of our culture will defend these values. And I'll say, well, we have to think about where those came from, and they came from the cross. And I'll quote you or things like that. And they're like, for them, that's often so new. They're like, what are you talking about? The relation between human rights and the cross and Jesus. It's interesting to me that it's something that comes as a shock to many today. I wonder if you might comment on that. Is there a reason why it's so people don't make that link anymore?
because, as I say, we take it for granted.
Mm.
And certainly I came to understand the role that crucifixion played through studying Roman society. And I wasn't writing about Christianity, but as it happens, the only detailed account we have of a crucifixion is that found in the New Testament. So we have these four accounts of it. We have no other accounts, almost because the Romans regarded it as so revolting and disgusting that they didn't want to talk about it. And there's a sense, Paul is embarrassed about it. I mean, he proclaims it, but he's clear, he's aware of how embarrassing it is. And Christian writers throughout the early years of the Christian period continue to acknowledge that, it is really embarrassing that Jesus died on a cross. And they will say that's kind of the point, but it's a kind of, ooh, okay, we've got to go through this. We've got to break through the pain barrier of this.
Yeah.
And I experienced that. I kind of came to understand that intellectually in the abstract, but then I came to experience it very viscerally while I was writing the book, because I paused and made a film about the theological underpinnings of what the Islamic State were doing in northern Iraq, and went there. And I went to a town called Sinjar, which I mentioned at the end of Dominion, this experience. And Sinjar was the main center for Yazidis, who were a religious minority in Iraq, who I'm sure lots of your listeners will remember were targeted very, very viciously and savagely, even by ISIS's own standards. So lots of the women notoriously were rounded up and enslaved. Girls as young as the age of 8 were sold into sexual slavery, and treated exactly as the Romans would have treated the women and girls and children of a town that the legions stormed. And a lot of men were killed and some were crucified. And I went to this town, Sinjar, which had been recaptured by the Kurdish militia a few weeks before. And I was in a town where people had been crucified. And the people who had done these crucifixions were a couple of miles away across no man's land. So within mortar range, terrifyingly close. And what was kind of filled me with a sense of existential dread, I realized, was that for the first time, I was kind of up against people who viewed crucifixion as the Romans had viewed crucifixion, as a way of broadcasting their own power and intimidating those who would rebel against it, and humiliating and shaming and torturing people in the most brutal way. And the cross had none of the weight of signification that it had for me, that it had for almost everyone I knew, that it had even for the most avowed anti-Christian atheist in the West. Everyone in the West knows that if you're injured and an ambulance turns up and it's got a cross on it, that's good news. But for ISIS, the cross, that's not what it represented. It represented what it had for the Romans. So for me, it was like kind of going to Jurassic Park and suddenly finding myself facing a tyrannosaur. It was that frightening. It was, you were brought up close against something that you might always have studied, but had never thought to meet it kind of in the wild.
Wow.
And that was, I came back and I rewrote the book so that I began with crucifixion.
Wow.
And I decided that I was absolutely going to put Paul's attitude to crucifixion and the crucified Jesus at a central point in the book. And there's a kind of symmetry in the book because the topic is so huge that I have to impose a kind of symmetry. So Paul writing about the cross appears in the 3rd chapter. And then when I was finishing the book, the 3rd chapter from the end has the other great figure, I think, in the story that I'm telling, the great figure who properly wrestles with and understands the nature of crucifixion, what it represents. And that's Friedrich Nietzsche, probably the most intellectually challenging atheist in history, I think. And he is challenging because he does understand what the cross represents. Because most atheists, they reject the Christian God, but they keep hold of Christian values and beliefs. They continue to believe that there's an inherent all human beings have an inherent dignity, that human beings have the right to certain, to help to shelter and food and water or whatever. And they continue to believe that that it's better to suffer than to impose suffering. But Nietzsche didn't buy into any of that, because
Right.
Nietzsche lamented the taming of Greek and Roman attitudes to power. He regarded Christianity notoriously as a slave religion. He saw it as sapping the strong and the powerful and the mighty and the handsome, and elevating those who properly should be kept at the bottom of the pile. And those are the implications that he drew from his understanding of what the cross properly represented, and how much of a rupture Christian valorization of the cross really is.
You know, it's you talk about Kurdistan, because Ben and I were on tour there before, just a little while before ISIS came in. And so when I saw those images of the crucifixions that you're talking about, or how they were beheading people, I understand the horror that you felt, because it was not just some abstract thing, and how we've made the cross, a piece of jewelry that you wear around your neck, and we don't really understand the significance of it. But another part that I think, I would say that if you read Paul, that he says the most significant part of the cross is that Jesus isn't still on the cross.
Right. So the
And
resurrection.
And Paul said, if Jesus did not raise from the dead, then we should be the most pitied of all people.
Yeah.
And it was such a known fact that Jesus said that he was going to rise from the dead, that they actually had guards in front of the tomb so they could bring him out and show that he was still dead after 3 days. But as you know, that didn't happen. So what do you think about the resurrection? How do you feel about that?
Well, as Paul says, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we're all fools, and our belief is worth nothing. And in a way that goes back to what you were saying, Luke, about how ultimately the whole edifice of Christian morals and beliefs is founded on the idea that Jesus did rise from the dead, and that something the strangest thing imaginable really did happen. And unless, in a sense, the strangeness of that, the weirdness of it, is what animates the entire belief system. Excuse me.
Bless you.
And really, that's what I came to understand, was that all the values and beliefs that I have as a liberal, belief in human rights, belief in the inherent dignity of human beings and the inherent equality of human beings, that these were myths as well, and that in a sense to believe in them requires at least as much a leap of faith as believing in the risen Christ, and that therefore that all of us, unless we go the full Nietzsche, are kind of believing in something improbable. Because it's incredibly improbable to believe that human beings have an inherent dignity. If you think that, there's no God and there's no coordinating explanation or reason behind creation, we're all just atoms. So, where's the value in human beings? We're just nature. We have no inherent quality at all. And what's to stop the strong from kicking sand in the face of the weak in that case? It's, oh God, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Speaking of,
See, it's now coming through on my computer. So
Yeah, it's cool. They're gonna get you one way or another.
it's definitely Nigel. He's very persistent.
sorry.
Hopefully it's something good. Well, Tom, I want to be sure to honor you for the fact that both in our little snippet email communications, and in what I perceive in this now as someone's who have now done hundreds of these interviews with really amazing people, there's the incredibleness of people and how unique they are, and then there's the sort of like the facet of people who are putting their whole hearts into what they're sharing. And I just want to be sure that you know that that comes across loud and clear, and it's so appreciated. And
Okay,
so,
well, that's kind.
yeah, it's just so valuable. I think sometimes, I'm sure you do a ton of these, and we do as well. And so sometimes so anyway, thank you for that. I guess my first question, and of course there's many, so I'll just keep it to one. But my first question is, how often are Christians frustrated when they discover that you maybe land more as a historian than you do as a religious scholar? And has that been a point of tension, or do you find that it's not really, not really an issue?
Well, I wasn't. You see, when I began this book partly for the reasons that I spelt out at the beginning of the show, but also because I wrote a book about the beginnings of Islam. In the Shadow of the Sword, which you mentioned at the top. And my take on that was that I didn't believe that a God had spoken to Muhammad, and therefore I didn't believe that the Quran had come from God, and that therefore it had to have come from somewhere else. And essentially trying to explain the beginnings of Islam not in terms of a deity intervening, but purely in human terms, meant that I ended up questioning quite a lot about the stories that Muslims tell about the character of Muhammad, where he came from, where the Quran might have come from. And I did a number of events, and I remember in one of those events, a Muslim saying, why have you done this? Why are you questioning our beliefs? You would never do this to your own beliefs. And actually, I felt the sting of that. And to be honest, by that point, I was already questioning my own beliefs, because my beliefs were kind of vested in an idea of the Enlightenment. It was the kind of Gibbonian myth of a dark age followed by light. But I'd already kind of come to reject that, really. And so I did think that that in a sense, dominion was to my kind of liberal beliefs what In the Shadow of the Sword was to Islam, a kind of questioning of the foundational myths. And I wanted to see, well, how far back can I trace these beliefs? Where do they actually come from? Because it's now perfectly clear to me that the Enlightenment is, well, there's a clue in the word. It's, the light of the spirit that was so important to the Reformation, the idea of toppling idols and banishing superstition and bringing people in darkness into light. That these are fairly culturally conditioned ambitions to have. And Voltaire had it just as much as Luther did, and ultimately you can trace them back through medieval ancient history, right the way back to the Hebrew prophets, who are kind of telling the Babylonians and the Egyptians that their idols are stock and stone, in exactly the way today that Richard Dawkins is kind of telling religious people that there is no God. It's the same impulse. So Richard Dawkins is an evangelist. He's preaching Evangelion. He's preaching good news. If you accept this good news, if you embrace it, if you open your heart to it, then you will be set free. You will see the world anew. But so in a sense, by writing Dominion, I was kind of questioning that set of beliefs, and I was essentially coming to realize that I was basically a Christian, and I think that we're all Christian. So it's not Christians who've been upset by the book. It's insofar as anyone has been upset by it or annoyed by it or disagree with it, it tends to be, the kind of person that I was, which was a kind of a liberal agnostic atheist, because, and I don't really understand why actually, enthusiasts for evolution should find this upsetting, because, in the field of culture, as in the field of biology, we're all descended from something, and people, who may not believe in God, but who are culturally Christian, I don't see why they should worry about that, actually. And to worry about it is a bit like Bishop Wilberforce in the debate with Huxley, insisting that he's not an ape and that he's not descended from an ape.
Well, it's to me, the other thing that's remarkable is I remember when I was studying on how to write and how to be a better writer and to sit down and write a book. And one of the bits of information that stuck with me is that I should envision a singular person that I'm writing to, someone that I could sit across the table from and sip coffee or tea or share a meal with, and really try to pour my heart out to that person. And what to me is so remarkable about what you've done is somehow you seem to have written to both the agnostics, the atheists, the liberals, the question, that's kind of like that side. But then you've also written to the Christians, the believers, the followers, the evangelists. So was that intentional?
Well, I wasn't writing for I was trying to write what I thought happened.
Yeah.
And, I was writing a book that I hope measures up as closely as I've been able to make it to the evidence. That's why I'm writing. I wasn't writing it in an apologetic tone. I wasn't writing it to annoy people or to, that wasn't. If it did, then it did. But or necessarily to please people. I wanted to write what I think happens.
Not that there's anything wrong with annoying people.
No. But you've got to. If you're writing history, you have to be true to your sense of what happened in the past.
Yeah.
And I think that perhaps one of the things that does slightly annoy me about the smugger kind of atheist is what's it's called the enormous condescension of posterity. The sense that people who lived in the Dark Ages were bigots and stupid and idiots, and nothing could be further from the truth. These are our forefathers. These are the people, and often foremothers. These are the people who made us who we are, and they deserve respect in that sense. And one of the great privileges of writing Dominion was the chance to read and immerse myself in the writings and the lives and the reflections of some of the most significant thinkers and people who've lived. And there was no period that I wrote about that I didn't want to stay and learn more. And I found again and again a kind of, I learned so much from reading these people. Be they Paul, the kind of people who are in the New Testament, the Church Fathers, the great writers of the Middle Ages, the Reformers, the Enlightenment philosophers, right the way up to Nietzsche. That all of them are deeply serious and worth study, and no one can study them and not feel kind of that your mind has been opened and your understanding has been improved. And I think a huge part of the kind of more evangelical kind of atheism is that actually it's just kind of godless anti-popery. It's clearly emerged from a kind of Protestant tradition of anti-Catholic invective. So all that stuff about the Middle Ages being backward and dark, the very idea of it being a middle age between the classical and the modern, this doesn't come from the Enlightenment. This is from the Reformers. This is from Luther and everybody looking back and saying that the Roman Church is kind of full of idolatry, and so all the language that gets turned against Christians generally by atheists in the contemporary world, they're just drawing on kind of anti-Catholic propaganda that has been there since the 16th century. And I at least Protestants, when they use it, are aware of what they're doing. They're aware that they're Protestants,
right?
But
I really appreciate that you mentioned faith, because I think there's often a bit of a false dichotomy that gets presented in culture today, that on one hand you have people who are committed to rationalism and science and they go where the evidence leads, and then on the other hand you have people that are just, it's about faith and you have to kind of throw your brain out to believe it. And you mentioned even in your own journey in this, you just as a historian wanted to go and interpret the history the best you could. You didn't come in with an agenda per se. which is, of course, the right thing to do as a historian. You just wanted to report what you believe it says.
But Ben, just to say, I mean, of course I have agendas.
Of course.
Because neutrality is impossible. And so in a sense, writing it is a kind of recognition on my part of where I'm coming from.
Right. And neutrality, of course, is a myth to some degree. We all carry lenses and biases, but I guess why is that the popular sentiment? Like, I get it from maybe the militant atheist, the one that's trying to propagate that message, and maybe that's the answer. But why is there that perception when in your book you lay it out so plainly? Like it's and why should we even be so bothered by it, as you say? Why do we have this popular sentiment that you got rational thinking, you have evidence-based ideas, and then you have this, fairy tales, and there's no reasonable inquisition into where these ideas actually may have come from?
Well, it's all because of the Middle Ages, ironically. So the representative figure for this is Abelard, Peter Abelard, French theologian in the Middle Age, in medieval Paris, who has the most amazing story. I mean, I'm sure lots of listeners will know it, but he's the most brilliant man of his age. He falls in love with the most brilliant girl of her age, Eloise. Eloise is the niece of a very powerful man in Notre Dame who isn't very pleased about this and ends up castrating Abelard. So kind of humiliating for Abelard. Eloise and Abelard are separated, continue to love each other. Abelard continues to be, the greatest theologian of his day. And at the heart of his theology is the idea that there's an inherent rationalism in the universe because God is rational. God obeys laws. God follows laws. It's there in his promise after the flood that there will be no second flood. It's there in the covenant that he agrees with the children of Israel. It's there in the covenant that is embodied in the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. So God is all powerful. He can do anything he likes. He can create he can work on miracles. He can transcend the rational. But at the same time, it makes sense to think that if he is happy to subordinate himself to laws, and he is rational, and he's created us in his image, then there is rationality within humans, and that rationality should enable us to discern the laws with which God has structured the cosmos. And so Abelard, as a kind of representative figure in these emergent institutions called universities, is able to establish the idea that the purpose of people within universities is both to make sense of, in a sense, what can't be understood, the power of God that transcends understanding, and yet at the same time to trace and to track what can be understood within the universe. And so by the 17th century, this has created a kind of understanding on the part of Christian philosophers that the universe is governed by laws that can be identified and kind of summed up in formulae. So, the great figures of 17th century natural philosophy, Newton and Galileo and Boyle and all these kind of people, that's what they're up to. When you move into the 19th century, you get for the first time in English this idea that the search for these laws can be summed up by a single word, science, which until the mid-19th century in English is not a word. You have sciences, but that just means kind of things that can be studied, things that can be understood, can be known. That's what it means. But science as a kind of abstract entity, that really is a kind of post-Darwin concept. And it's with Darwin, which weaponizes a kind of anti-Christian attitude that emerges from kind of radical Protestantism, that you start to get this sense that there's something called religion, which again is a very culturally contingent idea, and there is something called science. And it emerges in the late 19th century. And science, really, a definition of science is an explanation of the universe that is not religion. That's what it means. So an opposition to religion is kind of baked into the definition of it. And it's so successful because in a way it's kind of drawing on a tension that's been there, as I say, since the Middle Ages, that it immediately these two words immediately kind of take fire, and now people unthinkingly assume that something called religion and something called science has always existed, and they've always kind of been in opposition. So you'll get books on the war between religion and science, and people will talk about, you know, the monkey trial, and they'll talk about the hostility to Darwin, and they'll talk about Galileo, and they'll talk about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, and they'll talk about Greek science and Babylonian science and Chinese science and Arab science. And it's completely anachronistic because you can't really talk about science until the 19th century because it doesn't exist. And if you do that, you're imposing anachronistic understandings on it. So it's like saying that Julius Caesar conquered France. It's kind of right, but you're getting a lot wrong if you say that Julius Caesar conquered France. You're ignoring the way in which France is not the same as Gaul. And likewise, to say that the Greeks or the Babylonians had science is to miss the way in which our understanding of science has been crucially shaped by trends that are distinctive to the Latin form of Christianity.
You know, one of the fascinating things with how that all came about is that division that it then creates, leaving us in the context we are today. And I really enjoyed how in the book you sort of go through those different moments in history. And so nearer to the end, the later chapters, you're going into more contemporary history, and you analyze some different impacts of Christianity and the way secularism is, you know, part of our Western culture. And one of my favorite parts is you compare Dr. Martin King and Beatles, and you talk about how they're both defending values that could be taken back to Christianity. They come from Christianity, but one from the perspective of understanding who that link to Christianity and having the values linked to God, and then the other from the Beatles' perspective, making it void of God or void of that connection, and the difference between the two. And that was fascinating to me, how you were comparing those two. Could you explain that a little bit more? Like, why is it so different when you get two figures like that in history who are both defending Christian values? And you've made that point. Our culture today is, you know, it's got Christian values in it, but there's a difference between the ones that seem to have made it void of God and those that still understand that connection.
So the civil rights movement is clearly a deeply Christian movement. As you say, it's Dr. Martin Luther King. Yeah. You know, he's a Baptist minister. He's a reverend. And the appeal that he makes to white Christians is couched in the language of Scripture. So Exodus, you know, the God who redeems slaves from the rule of Pharaoh. And of course the narrative of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Jesus suffers the death of a slave, and the summons from Martin Luther King is for white Americans to share in Christian love with Black Americans. You know, there is no Jew or Greek. Then, as Paul says, then there is no black or white. And it's essentially because white Americans recognize the justice of that. Recognize that, you know, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That the civil rights movement is as successful as it is, and it establishes a kind of template for other people groups of people who historically have been oppressed and marginalized to kind of push the same campaign. So feminism would be an obvious example. The campaign for gay rights would be another. But these are more problematic because, you know, there's been a historical understanding of same-sex relationships within Christianity, or the authority of men over women in Christianity, that is quite hard-baked, and therefore kind of raises the hackles of conservative Christians in 1960s and 1970s America in a way that the civil rights movement, with its kind of call for the essential equality of human beings, doesn't. And so as a result of that, although the impetus and the impulse of gay rights campaigners and feminist campaigners is absolutely rooted in the same Christian seedbed as Martin Luther King's. It's rooted in the idea that the last shall be first, and so on, and that those who are oppressed have a right to be heard, and in a sense have a kind of a moral quality that the establishment don't have. It gets divorced from Christian scripture and from kind of going to church and the practice of going to church, and often indeed Christianity gets cast as what has to be rejected. It gets cast as patriarchal or homophobic or the embodiment of white supremacy or whatever, and so what you have in America since the 60s is a kind of sundering where conservatives identify with a kind of a Christianity that is hostile to progressives, and progressives cast themselves as hostile to Christianity, even though actually what's going on, it's a debate within Christian civilization about points of Christian theology. What do you choose to emphasize? What's more important? Care for the historically oppressed, or a kind of opposition to same-sex relations if you're dealing, say, with gay rights. I mean, that's essentially the argument that's going on. And the 60s is kind of fascinating, and I think up there with the 1520s as a kind of key turning point in the history of Christendom, because the kind of the key messages of Christianity that have, over the centuries and millennia, have been so revolutionary, get powerfully abstracted from the Christian story. So All You Need Is Love, the famous Beatles song, that's a mess. I have it at the beginning of Dominion. It's echoing the language of Augustine. Do as you will and love. I mean, that's how he sums up the Christian message. That's pretty much what hippies are saying in Haight-Ashbury. It's what the Beatles are saying when they put on their caftans and sing that song. And then actually in the careers of two of the Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison, you see the way in which people from in the progressive wing, the countercultural wing, deal with the Christian inheritance. Because John Lennon's, imagine the kind of great atheist anthem. Imagine there's no heaven. Sure, okay, Christians don't imagine that, but all the rest of it, imagine there's no possessions. I mean, that's what Jesus is saying. Where does all this stuff come from? It's pure Christianity, and enhanced by the fact that John Lennon at the time, in the heyday of the Beatles, is living on a hill where proto-communist Christians called the Diggers had set up a kind of community in the wake of the English Civil War and the beheading of Charles I. John Lennon is living in a gated community full of millionaires. So it's kind of brilliant. And of course, the other one who I wanted to write about in Dominion, I didn't have room, is George Harrison, who's a Catholic.
Beatles fan, I heard.
I'm a huge Beatles fan. I've thought about this a lot. But George Harrison, he's raised as a Catholic. He rejects it and he becomes a Hindu. But the kind of Hinduism that he espouses is a kind of a Christian Hindu fusion. And so his concert for Bangladesh, which I would have loved to write about, it's the first kind of great charity concert. It's the prototype for Band Aid and everything that follows. It's a really Christian idea that you should raise money to ease famine of people in a land that you don't belong to. I mean, this is not something that most people are doing, but of course it's there in the New Testament. Paul is writing to the churches saying, let's raise money for those who are suffering famine. So it's there right from the beginning. So in a sense, there's a discomfort in the modern West with the idea of Christianity because it's seen as too powerful, too strong. It's the establishment, it's square, it's boring, it's blue meanies, it's stuff to be rejected. And so George Harrison is kind of paradigmatic that you take your values and you associate them with a different tradition. The Hinduism that George Harrison is associating himself with isn't the Hinduism that says that it's a constant cycle of reincarnation and that there are different castes and that those who are at the top of the caste are morally superior to those who are at the bottom. That's not what he's identifying. He's with a kind of universal peace and love. Right. But the universal peace and love is basically, it's a Christian idea.
Christianity.
So do you envision like us moving? Like I know you talk about it like it's the air we breathe, right? It's like we can't even we even borrow from it to criticize it, and it's
Yeah.
just almost feels like an inescapable reality. But you mentioned Nietzsche earlier, and a lot of his superhuman Ubermensch kind of mentality or philosophy, some would say, was a foundation for Hitler, for Nazi Germany, for what came after him and the totalitarianism of the 20th century. And so there's a real consequence, and maybe it's an oversimplification, an atheist might argue, but there's a real consequence of a worldview that's departing from what Christianity has given Western culture. Do you see more of that? Do you see us heading more away and actually emancipating ourselves from our Christian ideals? And if so,
Well,
what do you think the consequences of that will be?
Well, you're right, of course, that when Nietzsche is writing about the repudiation of Christian values and the valorization of the strong, he says that great things, terrible things, things that will drown the world in blood will be done, and so it came to pass. And fascism was the most self-consciously anti-Christian revolutionary movement that the West has seen, because unlike the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, which was very hostile to institutional Christianity, but completely upheld two of the fundamental values of Christianity. One, that it's universal, that all human beings have an essential equality. The ideals of the French Revolution, the ideals of the Russian Revolution were deeply, deeply universalist. And also the idea that those who are weak and downtrodden have a moral value that is greater than those who are strong and powerful. That's the essence of the sans-culotte cheering the guillotining of a king, or Russian revolutionaries shooting the children of the Tsar. It's a kind of brutal expression again of that of Christ saying the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So in that sense, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution are radical expressions of Christian assumptions. The Nazis repudiate both those ideas. The Nazis, of course, aren't universalists. They think that certain races are stronger than others. And they absolutely don't think that the weak have any value. They think the weak should be crushed and destroyed. And they do this not because they're evil, but because they think they're doing what's right. By our standards, they're evil. And in the wake of the defeat of Hitler, Hitler is able, because his role in upholding values and principles that are so oppositional to Christianity, he basically replaces the devil for us as the emblem of evil. The Nazis become demons. Hell is Auschwitz. We don't need Jesus anymore because we have Hitler. Previous generations would say, what would Jesus do, and try and do it. We say, what would Hitler do, and we try and do the opposite, which is why the word you're a Nazi or you're Hitler is the kind of default response in a kind of Twitter war, in exactly the same way that you're worshipping the devil or you're a witch might have been in the 17th century. It's exactly the same. And so the shadow of Hitler hangs heavy over us still to this day. And in a sense, that's what keeps us Christian. That's why I think, in Europe, which was obviously experienced the full bloody force of Nazism, I think that's one of the reasons why church attendance falls off a cliff in the wake of the Second World War. I think, initially there's a kind of great upsurge of relief and gratitude, but then by the 60s, it's collapsing, because in a sense, the drama of the Second World War and the experience of fascism provides a kind of moral framework for us that is more immediate than the Christian one.
Wow.
So we cling to that. But I think the power of that is fading. And I do think that, having said that Christianity is part of the air we breathe, I think that atheism that is founded in opposition to Christianity remains Christian because people care enough about it to argue about it and to debate it. I think that what in the long run will be more damaging to the enduring influence of Christianity is the way that certainly here in Britain, probably much less so in America, but certainly here, people of my daughter's generation, they just don't know it. I mean, they just don't know anything about it. They don't know enough about it to oppose it. They don't know the parables really, or the most basic biblical stories, or the practice. And so that means that the nutrients in the soil of Christendom are kind of fading away a bit, I think, and I don't know where that will lead. I mean, I think that in our gut instincts, and it's millennials and younger who are, they often seem kind of militantly puritanical in their commitment to kind of radical ideals of egalitarianism and support for victims. So in that sense, they remain as kind of passionately Christian as any. But whether that will endure, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are two obvious, I think, ways in which the contemporary West is becoming, is not influenced by Christianity, is hostile to Christian values. One is the kind of idea of transhumanism that people in Silicon Valley are often very keen on. The idea that it's possible for people to transcend the limitations of Homo sapiens, whether that's with, nanotechnology or whatever. Because obviously to create superhumans, you're no longer equal. You no longer believe in a fundamental equality. You no longer believe in the inherent dignity of human beings, because you are aiming to make yourself superior to human beings. And I think the other one is that there's a kind of it's the most radical fringe of the green movement. But it was evident when COVID hit, in the slogan that we are the virus, humans are the virus, the sense that the world would be better off without humans. And again, that's a kind of very radical repudiation of the core Christian idea that human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have an inherent dignity. There's quite a trend within the green movement to say, well, actually, it's not just that human beings are on a level with animals. We're worse than animals because we are driving the planet to extinction. We're wiping out other creatures on this planet. We're destroying it and we're poisoning it. And I think that therefore that represents a real challenge for Christians, because
something you're saying, you brought up the whole virus idea, and I heard in one of your interviews that you were disappointed about how the church responded to the pandemic, and I thought that was very interesting. Can you talk about that?
Well, this is a very a response specific to England. I felt that certainly here, too many of the public faces of the various churches, Church of England, Catholic Church, Methodists, and so on, in the early months of the pandemic were behaving like public health officials. So the churches were closed down. When they gave messages, it was all about kind of washing hands and keeping apart from people and wearing masks and things like that, which is all good stuff to propagate. But we have other people who do that. We have public health officials and doctors and epidemiologists to do that. I felt that in the face of this terrible natural calamity, where we're brought up close against pestilence and mortality, Christianity historically has been the most successful attempt to explain why human beings are on the face of the planet, what we're doing here, why there's death, why there's suffering. And I felt that I wasn't interested in hearing from church leaders stuff that I could get from public health officials. I wanted to hear kind of weird stuff about the book of Job and the crucifixion and, sense of there being light amid darkness. And I may well have been unfair, because perhaps I'm sure that was going on and I wasn't looking for it adequately. But the public expressions of it, I felt disappointed by it. And I thought that it was a time for bishops to really start going on about, God looking after the children of Israel, or the light that shines in the darkness, and all that kind of stuff, to talk in that kind of language. And they weren't talking in that language, and it seemed to me a wasted opportunity.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. To hear you say that. Tom, thanks so much for your time. Well, just one final question, because I know we've kind of gone over what we asked you for, and appreciate your grace toward us. If you could help us envision what the West, maybe even the world, but especially the West, might look like had the story of Jesus never appeared? What might that be?
I think you get the best sense of that by going to India, which was equally a kind of great civilization where the gods that were worshipped, say around the time of Jesus's birth, are still worshipped to this day. And the pantheon has evolved, the practice has evolved, philosophies have grown up around it. The relationship of people in India to the supernatural is incredibly sophisticated. So you have temples to gods that reach back centuries and centuries and centuries, and people kind of believe in them to varying degrees. And that's what I think it would look like. So go to a deeply Hindu city, not one where there are lots of mosques, because without Christianity there'd be no Islam. But go to the deep south of India, where Hinduism is the overwhelming, prevailing way of understanding the world, and you'd have some sense there, I think, of what the Mediterranean might look like without Christianity.
Tom, I just wanted to say a thank you as well to the way in which you committed yourself to study so deeply the mark of Christianity throughout history, and to question, as you put it, to question your own beliefs and your own standpoint through this book. It really has had a powerful impact, as Chad said, on both, I think, to believers and to those that don't believe, but are so influenced. And it's just just thank you for committing the amazing amount of time it must have taken to really dig deep into those moments and to trace all of what the Christianity and the cross have meant. And it really has powerful fruit and effects.
Thank you. That's lovely of you to say so. Thanks very much.
Chad wrote a book, but it's 12 pages and mostly pictures. So
it's not for kids. It might have been good if it was.
You mentioned nutrients, and I think it's
it does have
this conversation, because I feel like everything you're saying, I'm just like, wow, this is rich stuff that I want to digest, that I know we've had a lot of comments to that effect. If you have not read Dominion, you need to. Don't let the length of it scare you, because it's amazing for the length of it, how quickly it reads. It's brilliant in that it's both profound and simple at the same time, in my view, and it's just so well done. Really, really appreciate it. Quite frankly, I'm not sure why we were even able to get you on this podcast. I feel like you should be on every podcast. I'm loving this. I'm loving this payoff. I feel like when I hear you talk, I feel like I'm listening to like the Joe Rogan podcast or something, and you're the guest. But here we are. You're gracing us with your presence. So, thank you so much. Is there anything? Again, it's tom-holland.org, because I was initially looking it up, and apparently Tom Holland without the .org is indeed the Spider-Man Tom Holland.
He's a Spider-Man. Yeah.
Man.
Well,
you got there first. Come on.
Everything.
There are actually hundreds of Tom Hollands. So there's also a guy who did Child's Play, director.
Hey, there's a great comment. The Kent Myers comment I thought was really cool. He said, "It's not the Tom Holland I expected, but this one is much more fulfilling."
Hey, Kent.
Look, now there is a Kent for the ages. Look, we're not into superhero movies anyway. Don't worry. You're in the eyes of Provoke and Inspire. You're the #1 Tom Holland.
Oh, guys,
come on.
All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna hit this little outro. If you want to just say goodbye to us offline, that would be cool. But again, I know our listeners are going to be really blessed by this. Thank you so much for your time, for your dedication. I look forward to what's next. I know that you're going to be used to do amazing things. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.